Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Megha Rajagopalan. I'm a reporter with BuzzFeed News in London. And I'm really excited to welcome all of you to our discussion, Iranians on Social Media, the Only Way to Be Heard. I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion today about the internet in Iran. I'll first introduce our three panelists who have all done really fascinating and different kinds of scholarship on social media, Iran, and the internet. Our first panelist who will be presenting her report today is Holly Dagres, who is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. She's also the editor of the Iran Source, as well as Mina Source blog, and the curator of the weekly newsletter, The Iranist. Our second panelist, Samin Kargar, is a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University. She's focusing on public-private partnerships on cybersecurity. She's also a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's DFR lab, and she investigates information warfare in the Middle East. And our third panelist, Masa Ali Madani, is a senior researcher with Article 19 and a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. She's worked on research and advocacy on digital rights within civil society for the past decade, and she studies political communication online in Iran for her dissertation. Before we start, I would like to just welcome everybody just throughout this discussion to submit questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. If you have any, and we would be delighted to answer them at the end of this event. I think to start with, Holly is going to open with a short presentation that derives from her recent paper, Iranians on Social Media. And after that, we'll start our discussion. So Holly, take it away.
Thanks, Megha. First, I have to say I'm absolutely delighted to be on this awesome all-women's panel. Before I begin this PowerPoint, I also want to thank the Atlantic Council, particularly the Future of Iran Initiative and DFR Lab for supporting me with this timely report, and especially the brave Iranians that were willing to speak to me. So let's get started. Okay, I take it everybody can see this, so let's go. If you were on social media during the 2020 US presidential election, you probably saw this viral deep fake. It was created by a 27-year-old content creator based in Iran. So you might be looking at this and wondering, well, what gives? This video exemplifies how Iranian netizens are using information and communications technology, as well as the creativity with which they are pushing to expand economic, cultural, and political boundaries under the Islamic Republic. Iran reportedly has 57.4 million internet users out of its 83 million population. 35% of the world's most visited websites are blocked in Iran, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And Iranians rely on circumvention tools like VPNs to get by. Ironically, most Iranian officials, from the supreme leader below, have Twitter accounts despite the ban. This includes all 7 qualified candidates in the June 2021 presidential election. February 2021 polling data from the Iranian Students Polling Agency reported that 74% of Iranians over the age of 18 use social media and messaging apps, the most popular of those being Instagram and WhatsApp, both owned by Meta or Facebook. Other apps making waves in Iran include video sharing app TikTok, audio-only app Clubhouse, and video dubbing app Dubsmash. Of those 3, TikTok and Clubhouse are also blocked. So what are Iranians using these social media apps for? Well, they're using them for entertainment, economic, and socio-political purposes. There are countless Persian language articles about generating revenue on Instagram. Interestingly, Iranian Instagram influencers, just like those in the West, use their accounts for sponsorships, marketing products, and other advertisements. Top grossing influencers can make an estimated 1.5 billion to 3 billion rials, roughly $5,000 to $10,000 a month, in a country with skyrocketing inflation and a national currency that has lost more than 80% of its worth in recent years. While some Iranians use Instagram as paid advertisement space, others use it as free promotional space for arts and culture and services including dentistry, beauty salons, and underground tattoo parlors. Many restaurants and cafes also rely on Instagram in lieu of websites for orders and reservations. Some Iranians use social media purely or initially to produce entertaining content like parodies, pranks, and satires, perhaps with the long-term goal of monetizing their account. About 80% of online purchases in Iran are made on Instagram, Telegram, and WhatsApp, while 11 million people reportedly derive their income from such apps. Instagram also empowers Iranian women. Instagram gives women who sometimes cannot work due to traditions or family obligations the opportunity to start a business from home. It's worth mentioning that due to the pandemic, Iranians have been using social media even more readily, and as a result, businesses have also multiplied online. I'm going to play a video compilation to give you an idea of Instagram's many uses in Iran.
دکتر فرهاد هستم در منقل برگر و اینم برگر تزریقیه. حسن هم دکتر. قربان شما. همه زبان گردن بنده بود. It's like you barely even. Listen, the looks are different to me. It's like you barely even know me. You was missing from me. زندگی موفقیت سال نو میلادی رو بهتون تبریک میگم. سال نو مبارک. سال نو مبارک. ایران خاک دل ایران میگم ایران خاک دل ایران عشق یارم اونجاست. این روزا یک سریال کره‌ای بسیار موج شده و خیلی هم طرفدار داره. کجا بخواد جنگ برقصم خود رنگی بده کجا بخواد جنگ اینا دارن هی میان نزدیک بگو برن عقب میگه مذاکره فرکانس
Social media, quote, is also accountability technology in that it provides efficient and powerful tools for transparency and monitoring of the Islamic Republic. Social media has played a prominent role in amplifying footage taken by Iranian citizen journalists of bloody crackdowns by security forces. Of note is the Aban or November 2019 protests in which security forces killed and arrested thousands. Because of the footage permeating online, social media has also been helpful for human rights organizations documenting human rights violations. We've also seen social media be used as an essential tool for amplifying Iranian women who publicly protest compulsory hijab or speak out as part of Iran's Me Too movement. Viral hashtags have also been used to draw attention to issues such as capital punishment and the Supreme Leader's January 2021 ban on Western vaccines. Social media is also used to mock the leadership of the Islamic Republic and criticize the families of the elites, particularly the children of government officials with connections, known as Aghazades. Shaheen Milani, the executive director of the US-based Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, told me that social media is a tool of change for Iranians that has, quote, changed the landscape tremendously. He notes that, quote, grave human rights abuses that took place in secrecy in the past will be exposed within days or even hours now. But that's assuming the internet is back on, which is something I'll discuss in a moment. I put together another video, but I should warn you that some content might be disturbing to watch.
Never gonna give you up. حکومت با گران فروشی جیبوری میکند. یه شانه تخم مرغ 50,000 تومان، این چه ورزشه؟
کشیدم چرا باید اینجوری بشه؟ بگو گناه قصرم چی بود؟ ما مسلمت آمیزیم مسلمت آمین. سرشو کوبیدم به ماشین.
Since the 2009 post-election protests known as the Greve Movement, the Islamic Republic views social media as a national security threat. Quote, the seminal event realigned much of Iran's national security forces and resources towards internet governments, policies, and laws, noted Article 19 in one of its reports. Recognizing that Iranians can document rights violations and that social media and messaging apps can quickly mobilize masses of people, authorities have, over the years, resorted to blocking access to websites and internet throttling to defeat circumvention tools. However, authorities took internet censorship to another level when they shut down the internet for a week during the November 2019 protests, with varying levels of mass disconnections lasting 1 to 2 weeks. Since those very protests, there have been at least 5 internet shutdowns, most significantly during times of unrest. Where blocking apps don't work, cybercrime laws help tighten control over Iranian users. In October 2018, Iran's cyber police claimed it had arrested some 75,000 people over an 8-year period for online activities, some merely for criticizing the government or dancing to Western Iranian pop music in their bedroom. Nilofar, an influencer awaiting a prison sentence for a social media post, explained to me that the government is cracking down on social media because it shows how things are in Iran. Since 2011, Iran has been making moves to implement the National Information Network, or NIN, which is a domestic internet that is separate from the international internet that we all use. Authorities allege the goal of the domestic internet is to protect Iran's internet infrastructure from foreign cyber attacks and to counter a quote unquote cultural invasion from the West. But it's clear that the NIN is also being used to disconnect Iranian users from the international internet. In July 2021, the hardline majority parliament moved closer to implementing the so-called protection bill, or Tahrir Siyanat, that would curb online freedom. To summarize, this bill would criminalize VPNs to quote unquote, protect Iranians from Western and other un-Islamic online content. It would require the security apparatus to take control of Iran's internet gateways from the civilian government, thereby giving access to the security and intelligence apparatus. This would make internet shutdowns easier and less transparent. Additionally, international social media and messaging companies are expected to open an office in Iran to collaborate on content moderation and surveillance. If companies don't follow guidelines, their platforms will be permanently blocked. The most damning consequence of the bill is the possibility that the NIN would become the dominant platform Iranians use to get online. So, if the protection bill passes, it wouldn't just impact Iranians' abilities to connect and communicate with one another, but also to the outside world. The content creator that produced the US election deepfake that I showed at the beginning of the video told me, quote, if the internet gets shut down by the government, there's nothing I can do here. If it happens, it will take Iran back to the Middle Ages and people will suffer heavily. No sane person wants this internet bill. Already in recent months, Iranians have been experiencing internet disruptions, and in some cases, their circumvention tools have stopped working. This so-called protection bill is expected to be ratified in mid-March. Since the 1979 revolution, the Islamic Republic has been under some form of US sanctions. At one point, technology-related sanctions on Iran were so extensive that they would, quote, encompass everything developed in the computer age. It wasn't until the 2009 Green Movement that these restrictions were seen as problematic, which kicked into gear the US Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, issuing a personal communications general license. This license was updated on several occasions to include things like social media and messaging apps, browsers, cell phones, and computers. When the Iran deal was signed in 2015, sanctions related to technology weren't altered as they were not nuclear related. As a result, these sanctions remain in place under 3 consecutive presidencies and have not evolved to include the latest ICT. Additionally, despite several amendments to the general license, the vague language of technology-related sanctions continues to confuse tech companies, which are risk-averse and fear changes in interpretations depending on who's in the White House. As a result, these sanctions have forced the Iranian tech community to move their communications platforms and cloud services inside Iran, thereby making it easier for authorities to conduct surveillance and shut down the internet during times of unrest. It needs to be said and emphasized repeatedly that US sanctions are not the reason for internet censorship in Iran. That onus falls on the Islamic Republic. Now, I just want to briefly talk about an interesting example. In 2019, Microsoft-owned GitHub, an open source hosting site, had restricted its services to the Iranian developer community to comply with US sanctions. However, in January 2021, GitHub announced that it will offer its free and paid services to Iranians again after OFAC issued a license. What happened was that GitHub had gone out of its way and devoted resources and time to obtain this license to continue working with Iranians. This is something that all tech companies should be doing. Nevertheless, the Treasury Department is primarily responsible for updating the General D license and providing accurate guidance to tech companies that are either reading the guidelines restrictively or over-complying. This leads me to some of my recommendations. The Joe Biden administration and other Western governments must uphold end-to-end encryption and privacy standards without interference from governments to prevent any nefarious cooperation between tech companies and authoritarian states. OFAC must broaden and update its general license and also provide guidance and assurance to tech companies. If anything, the Biden administration should take a page out of how the US deals with disaster relief aid and offer authorizations rather than exemptions. The Biden administration should also be more vocal when activists, journalists, and ordinary Iranians are arrested for their internet activities. Finally, social media companies must increase resources on Iran to support Iranian users. This includes keeping Persian language content up and ensuring that apps remain accessible, such as continuing to offer light versions which use less data. And aforementioned, tech companies must also devote resources and time, like GitHub did, to acquire general licenses for their products. Thank you.
Holly, excuse me. Holly, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I think this is a great starting point and gives us a lot of themes to touch on in this discussion. I wanted to start with a kind of a little bit of a broader question that I had for you based on your paper. I think one thing that struck me about it is how the internet and particularly social media has played a role in kind of like liberating or facilitating speech and even including political speech in Iran, but it's also increasingly being used by authorities to crack down on that same kind of speech. And I was wondering if you could unpack how those two dynamics like sort of coexist and work together. And do you see the internet in Iran as liberating speech, as facilitating expression, or do you see it as a means for the government to exert social control? And sort of how do those two things fit together?
Well, Iranians historically have always been a vocal society, and what social media has done is amplified that, especially over the past few years, where Iranians are fed up with their living circumstances, whether it's the economy or the government itself. Iranians have become much more outspoken. We see these in the protests that have been ongoing and the anti-government chants they've been chanting. Having that been said, one of the things that over the years we tend to see is that there's this hope that the so-called liberation technology would help essentially free people living under repressive regimes like the Islamic Republic. And this is certainly a opinion that has been conveyed in Washington over the years from various circles. And I think it still continues to be a topic, certainly. But one of the things that policymakers fail to account for is how authoritarian governments would respond to social media over the years. And one of the people that was very good at debunking this theory was a scholar by the name of Evgeny Morozov, and he describes like this notion of social media and the internet liberating people as being a cyber utopianism, and that it's a naive belief in the emancipationary nature of online communication. So and it's interesting because when he wrote his book in 2011, I think it was called The Net Delusion, it had come out the same year the Arab Spring or Arab uprisings had happened. And he had essentially predicted everything we see today on how authoritarian governments respond to social media and dissent online. And with Iran, that's no different. We see, not just as I've mentioned, that they're throttling the internet, they're blocking websites, they're now shutting down the internet. And one thing I didn't really touch on in my report that much, and I'm hoping we'll discuss later, is the fact that the Islamic Republic has relied on troll and bot armies to silence dissidents, whether they're in Iran, and even people in the diaspora that are journalists or activists. And it's something that they have only increased over the years and gotten better at. And I think it really is a testament to how they feel threatened by the internet and social media. And one thing I actually didn't get to read in my PowerPoint is this one quote, which was from this Iranian social media influencer who was waiting a prison sentence. And she said, "Social media is our only hope for making changes here. It has been our way of communicating with the world when we had no other chance. Everything else is banned, and now they are going to cut our only hope to being heard by the world." And I think that really speaks to the power of social media for Iranians and why the Islamic Republic's going out of its way to silence these voices.
There's definitely a lot to unpack there. Well, I want to come back to some of that, but before we do, Masa, I actually had a question for you about something that Holly also brought up in her presentation, which is the so-called protection bill that we've been hearing about for quite a long time now. I was wondering if you could sort of give us an update on like sort of what are the kind of most recent developments in Parliament with regards to this bill, and I was wondering if you could also talk about what Iran has been doing in the lead up to the implementation with this bill, like, including tampering with the internet by throttling and through shutdowns and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Holly did a really great job of kind of outlining what's happening with the bill and how it fits within the traditions of centralization and control that Iran has been working towards over the years. So the bill had a lot of attention and focus, especially over the summer. The end of July, we saw Parliament vote on the fact that this bill is going to be put into force in a very special way, in that it's not the final draft of the bill will not have to be voted on. It will be enforced for an experimental period of about 5 years, after which time Parliament will review it. So once this draft is finalized and everyone on this select committee that's responsible for drafting the bill, it will come into force. Before in the late fall, they were indicating that it's going to be finalized by March. However, there's been quite a bit of back and forth. There's been some internal politics around the administration of who is going to have, control over a lot of the internet regulation. There's new bodies and new centers of control, especially the armed forces are supposed to be very involved in controlling internet gateways and things like that. And so there was some politics around, the Ministry of Information, Communication and Technology fearing a loss of power. And so they've been redrafting the bill to sort of take care of the politics behind it. But basically the draft that we saw come out during the summer has remained in place with the same concerns that many activists and ordinary Iranians, frankly, have about what the conditions for internet use is going to be once this comes into force. And so, the activism that we've seen grassroots inside of Iran against this bill is a bit unprecedented, because we have folks from all sorts of political background and spectrums really coming out and campaigning against this bill. Just because of, the impact it's going to have on, Iran's tech industry, the impact it's going to have on, ordinary users. It's going to have, it's going to change the way that users will be online. And one of the main things that they're going to be doing is that they are trying to really cement the national information network, which are, the different systems that make up, there's the national applications, there's, the national internet traffic that's kind of separated from international traffic. And so they are creating a condition whereby they've announced to foreign applications that they can remain online in Iran if they cooperate with authorities. And so, as we know, especially with the nature of sanctions and the nature of rights online in Iran, companies like Facebook, or Meta as it's now known, and Twitter are likely not going to cooperate. Twitter is already censored, but we have Instagram, which is one of the biggest social media applications, which is not censored yet, is under the threat of censorship with this bill. And you would say, of course, Iranians all use VPNs or proxies, virtual private networks, but part of this bill and part of a lot of the, I think, technical work and some evidence that they're making progress on this is that they will be blocking VPNs. And one of the conditions of the VPN is to make legal VPNs, which feeds into the system they've been thinking of creating, multi-tiered access to the internet based on your profession and various different things associated to your identity. So, like if you're a doctor or a lawyer, you'll get a different type of internet that might, be able to access certain parts of the international internet or certain platforms or applications, whereas other users might only have access to the national network. So there's a lot of these different concerns. And one of the biggest, points of it is that it's going to truly help nationalize the internet in Iran.
And Masa, to that point, it's really fascinating because Meta, Twitter, and some of these other social companies have really seemed to struggle in dealing with this kind of rising tide of data localization rules that many countries, including authoritarian countries, have put in place. And I was curious about your thoughts on how tech companies should react to this. Do you think they should be pushing back? Have they pushed back, in the kind of course of discussion of this bill?
I think their hands are a bit tied with how they are going to get involved with Iran. If you recall back in 2015, there were some discussions and murmurs within these companies that maybe they will have relations with Iranian authorities, and maybe they could, work out some sort of cooperation or at least presence within Iran with something like that. But we've moved far away from that, and there's been a lot of erosion of rights in Iran. And so it would be very hard to see that they would have any sort of cooperation within this bill. I know that the companies are very much aware of this bill. And one of the things that has been happening in what people say is the lead up to the enforcement of the bill is that they have been throttling access to Instagram. And, there's lots of evidence from network measurements that Instagram is, being tampered with, the connections for Iranian users inside of Iran. And I know that the company has been aware of this, and they have been trying to implement different solutions. They released Instagram Lite a few months ago to help with, the fact that the network is becoming very unstable for their platform in Iran. So Instagram Lite has been available for Iranians to download. In terms of what they can do to stop these technical developments, it could be very little if this is enforced. So we'll have to see exactly the nature of this bill and what it entails in practicality. However, one thing that a lot of Iranians have been noticing is the fact that their rights on the platform itself have not really been respected either. And so this has become a very big phenomenon, and it's always been a really big issue in the way that, these big American companies are doing content moderation for foreign languages, especially non-Western languages. It's been a big issue for Palestinian activists who've noticed a lot of content takedowns, and it's become a very major issue for Iranians posting in Persian. And if you just take a look on Persian social media, you'll see all sorts of communities. You'll see Iranian LGBTQ communities from inside Iran and outside of Iran protesting the fact that their accounts are being taken down, that their content is being taken down for, infringing on different sets of policies. And oftentimes these are just misinterpretations of Persian, misinterpretations of the cultural context or the satire behind the content. And so this has developed into a really big issue. I could probably go on about this a lot, but just to flag that this is something that's been happening online for Iranians.
And Samin, I have a question that's a little bit related to this. When we're talking about the NIN, like this idea of a nationalized internet, it's interesting to me that this is happening kind of at this point in time, because this is a time when Iranians, of course, have been on services like Instagram and Telegram for a really long time and are used to using those. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how the Islamic Republic is working to pull people away from those foreign social media platforms and satellite TV and stuff like that, and then push them on to the NIN. What sort of means have they used to convince people to use more domestic services, and also to what extent do they feel they have an obligation to convince people?
Sure. First of all, congratulations to Holly, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and DFR Lab for hosting us. So the National Information Network has been this constant ongoing debate for more than a decade now, with the government on one hand trying to push people to this domestic network and promising more bandwidth at lower cost, which, as the economic circumstances in Iran become sort of deteriorating, it increasingly may be an appealing deal for a lot of people, especially those in the lower income brackets. There are multiple strategies, I would say, that the Islamic Republic has pursued over the past few years. In the aftermath of Telegram being permanently blocked, we saw a surge in the push for people to use domestic messaging applications. There were multiple of those, including Gap, iGap, Surush, and others. Polls show that they have not been really successful in convincing people that those are secure and as appealing platforms that could replace platforms like Telegram and WhatsApp, which is the most widely used platform for messaging right now in Iran. But on the other hand, there has been this constant threat of people not watching the official propaganda of the state through the IRIB, which is the state-owned broadcaster. So to pull away from social media, they've been promoting domestic applications to pull people away from satellite televisions, which has been the biggest rival of IRIB. There has been a surge in internet protocol televisions and video on demand services in Iran that the state has been trying to push, especially the Rouhani administration tried a lot to make it easier for private businesses to be licensed and operate in an environment that's allegedly less monitored by the state and like the IRIB apparatus, and at the same time provide higher quality media productions to end users. And let's remember, these are platforms that operate on the National Information Network, which means, as I said, more bandwidth and less cost to the end user. So all around an appealing deal for a lot of people. But that itself has become this whole big legal and power grab fight inside Iran, because of course IRIB is not going to let go of its authority over multimedia production. While the Rouhani administration was trying to bring everything under the umbrella of the government and kind of become the sole authority over this matter. Throughout the legal fights, the orders from the supreme leader and other incidents, it seems that IRIB has gradually won this fight. And with the Raisi administration being in the office now, it seems more and more likely that that promise of less censorship and like higher quality productions maybe become less convincing. But at the same time, that appeal for end user is still there. In a survey that I worked on last year, we saw that over half of the sample population that we studied were aware of these platforms and were using them on a regular basis. And ease of use, that sort of cultural and language ease was a prominent factor in kind of bringing them to use these platforms. And interestingly, a lot of them said that it didn't really matter if they had satellite television at home, because streaming is a big deal in Iran. And when people have this option of paying less for more bandwidth and kind of use a content that's already kind of culturally appropriate, and they don't need subtitles or translation services or all of that, it makes it an interesting platform and medium for them to use. So I think I would wrap it up by saying that while the IPTV and video on demand services in theory can promote media diversity in Iran, I think the power fight behind it is going to make it difficult for people to enjoy the kind of original promise that was behind these platforms. So it's to be seen.
Yeah, it's interesting, just following on that, it's interesting to that you mentioned that Surush and other similar messaging platforms that the government has promoted as sort of alternatives to WhatsApp are actually not that popular. And it made me think about what Masa brought up about this idea of like legal VPNs and people just being pushed to these VPNs that may be stealing their information or may not be secure. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about, you know, how internet users in Iran, like how conscious are they of using you know, foreign social media services, like perhaps for privacy reasons or perhaps to feel a bit freer to communicate? Is this something that a lot of people are concerned about, or is this something that, you know, people who are mainly engaging in political speech and stuff like that would be thinking about the most?
Is that for me or Masa?
Oh, sorry, for you, Samin.
Okay, sure. I think we've seen a lot of debate and awareness around the issue of security and privacy. And let's remember, using social media platforms or messaging applications is not a standalone, I decide one day that I'm going to use Surush. It also depends on what kind of platforms my community is using. And so if a lot of people that I know and are my contacts are not on those platforms, then what's the point of me migrating to a new platform? And so this is an area that the government hasn't really been effective in terms of convincing people to use these platforms. And with the security and privacy concerns that keep popping up from time to time with regard to the domestic applications, it's become increasingly difficult for the government to make that push happen.
Sorry. And Masa, sort of in a related way, I was wondering if you could explain a bit, like we've heard a bit about the implications of the bill for tech companies. And I was wondering if you could talk also about kind of something that is almost on the other side of the coin, which is how these same companies have to deal with US sanctions and how that affects the way they provide services to internet users in Iran. I was wondering if you could sort of unpack that, talk a little bit about the impacts on internet users and whether this is sort of enabling the government to promote the NIN further.
Yeah, so this is a really, I guess, rich topic that's been highly debated. And when Holly introduced this topic in her remarks, she placed this topic in kind of a nuanced and qualified way, which I really liked, which she said, this is a problem, but by no means are sanctions responsible for the state of affairs. That responsibility is really with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it's really important to phrase it in that way. And when we do talk about the responsibility of the United States or American companies, we should really put it in the framework of we're dealing with this system, you know, that is rife with human rights abuses, including online. We sitting outside of Iran have very little ability to, you know, get them directly to improve their laws and policies and conditions there. The things that we do have impact on, we can have some impact in direct advocacy with the United States government, with American tech companies, which is why we do spend time talking about it, not to deflect from the fact that, you know, the real responsibility lies somewhere else. So just wanted to preface it with that. And the topic of sanctions, it has, there's two dimensions. There's one is the content moderation dimension that we see with social media. And so this is to do with the topic I was discussing beforehand. And this, Facebook has a policy, or rather Meta has a policy called dangerous individuals and organizations. And because Facebook is an American company, it really adheres to these US policies. And so the United States government has a foreign terrorist organization list. And this list became especially pertinent to Iran and the Islamic Republic of Iran because the Trump administration decided to list the Revolutionary Guards on this list. And immediately Facebook had to start removing the accounts of Revolutionary Guard members, any accounts overtly promoting the guards, and frankly, any other entity in Iran that belonged on this list. The problem with this has been the implementation of this. So, just this past week, I was in touch with a Persian news organization outside of Iran that was having content. They were posting news just about the Revolutionary Guards, and Instagram was mistakenly removing it just because they don't have the capacity to really implement this policy with the right resources or the right Persian context. And so this has kind of created a bit of a mess on top of all the other policies that are being implemented in a really problematic way in the Persian language, because this organization is, there's so much news, there's so much content revolving around this organization, which controls so much inside of Iran. This has become a really big problem for content moderation with this platform. So that's been one of the ways that sanctions has been, I guess, affecting that sort of policy. The other side of it, which is something that we have discussed a lot, is how sanctions is affecting access to the internet in Iran. And back in 2013, we had General License D1 implemented, which was supposed to allow services online for personal communications, technology services for personal communication to be available to Iranians inside of Iran. And, what we've seen is the implementation of this can sometimes be problematic. Personal communications can sometimes be interpreted in different ways. And so we've seen a lot of platforms deny their services inside of Iran. We've seen applications like as benign as an application that's supposed to be available for the blind not be available inside of Iran. And personal communications becomes complicated with financial transactions. So if an application or a software involves finance, it's likely not going to be not be available in Iran. And so a lot of, cloud services like Google Cloud Services, AWS from Amazon, a lot of their services have not been available to Iranians. And so the tech sector in Iran, especially developers, software engineers, they've had to move away from these services that most of the tech community rely on. And, this has been an incentive for the National Information Network to be strengthened. Before it even became a law that Iranians needed to, use Iranian hosting providers, the American sanction system made it kind of illegal for any .ir domain to have an American hosting provider. And given that the majority of these services are often found in the United States, this was a really good push in favor of the policies of the Islamic Republic to move, Iranians onto the National Information Network. And so we've seen how the sanctions policy has really complemented the Islamic Republic's policies. And what needs to be done, as it's been outlined in this report, is a strengthening of the general license, the one for personal communications. There has been a lot of lip service about this needing to be adhered. The former Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, even came out and made a statement that American tech companies should be adhering to this. But there really wasn't any action. There wasn't anything passed to strengthen the wording or an additional general license. And there wasn't really, it didn't seem like there was much pressure on the companies to do much in terms of reviewing what services they were making available to Iranians. The one exception, which was already mentioned, was GitHub, and they actually did put time and resources in getting a special license for all of their services for their Iranian users. And having spoken to different companies, this seems like a big task to take on, to seek out what GitHub did. And GitHub, I believe it took 2 years for them to get that. And so it's now on either the US government helping or companies going out individually and doing this.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly complex. I guess on these companies, we've talked about users, and we've talked about the companies themselves. Samin, I wanted to ask you about another aspect of this, which is something you've done some work on. I was wondering if you could explain a bit about how the Islamic Republic is using state-sponsored troll armies online to reshape opinion. And I was wondering if you could speak specifically about what the impacts that has on dissidents, as well as people from minority communities.
Yeah, sure. So the issue of state-affiliated trolling and harassment actually has a long history. It's not limited to Twitter or Instagram or these more recent platforms. It's basically as old as online social spaces themselves. It even existed during the golden days of blogging, especially in 2009 and around Green Movement, when the state-affiliated accounts would comment on a lot of like reformist or sort of progressive blogs or go after different bloggers. Then, of course, this kind of behavior morphed into the forums that we see on places like Twitter or Instagram. But back in the day, we weren't using the language of information or influence operations, not even disinformation. But as it became a more prominent and pressing issue, especially in the US and elsewhere, we realized that in hindsight, the kind of behavior that we have been seeing in the form of harassment shares many of the characteristics of disinformation and or information operations. So the objective when it comes to this sort of campaigns is often twofold. One is engineering a narrative that serves the state's official rhetoric to manipulate public opinion about different topics. And secondly, to silence dissent, especially when it comes to vulnerable or marginalized populations. It's basically a form of censorship that's more participatory and more organic looking. In my work, I've researched how this plays out with regard to journalists, especially in the diaspora, and gender equality activists, religious minorities, artists, and other kinds of influencers. These disinformation campaigns often seek to intentionally discredit narratives or people that try to raise awareness about certain topics. And they also serve as a barometer of the Islamic Republic's sensitivities regarding different topics, especially national security. Issues like the nuclear negotiations, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, or the downing of the Ukrainian flight are among some of the most recent examples. These operations also target social issues that the Islamic Republic perceives as quote unquote trouble, because more attention to them can change lifestyles, increase demanding state accountability, or instigate legal reform. And these are issues around LGBTQ rights, civil partnerships, or what they call white marriage, and the like. How they do this on different platforms can take different forms. We see mass reporting on one hand, targeting special accounts and going after different individuals, targeting them with a really specific narrative, words, keywords, so that they basically develop a narrative that they want to see, not the narrative that those influencers or individuals want to promote. Instagram, as was mentioned earlier, is one of the most popular platforms in Iran, which is not blocked yet. So naturally, a lot of focus is on policing, manufacturing narratives, and managing those narratives on the platform. It also makes things easier for those in charge of these operations because they don't need, for example, to worry about providing reliable VPNs to their forces to go after silencing individuals. So from a financial and managerial perspective, it also makes sense for the censors. I'm going to stop there and just give you room for follow-up if you need to.
Yeah, just to follow up, there's so much to follow up there, but I'm curious about your point about this idea that these troll armies are not just going after people in Iran, but are actually going after journalists and other people with big platforms in the diaspora. And I was wondering if you've noticed in your research whether this has actually had a chilling effect on people outside of Iran, and how it impacts them.
Yeah, I think over time, people have learned to cope with this issue. Maybe 10 years ago or less, people were kind of threatened, especially those who had concerns about their families in Iran or didn't want parts of their private lives promoted to everyone inside the country, became more cautious in broadcasting who they took pictures or posted pictures with on their Instagram or Facebook pages, for example. People who talked about sensitive topics like, for example, Pride Parade in London, would receive so much trolling and be targeted with disinformation about their own private lives that they would go silent for a while. But then, as I said, over time, people realized that they were not the only targets and that there were resources or other people they could share this. And I think people have become more transparent and more honest to talk about trolling and when they become targets of that behavior, which on its own is a way of breaking the silence. And I really encourage that, even though it's hard on those who just are on the spotlight and experience those moments.
And just one more follow-up on that. Some of these techniques that you describe, like mass reporting, for instance, like these are things that troll armies, they're like very characteristic of troll armies. And you would expect it's something that the social platforms should kind of know how to deal with. And I'm curious, like, how the platforms have responded to some of these kind of, behaviors that could be described as inorganic and can be documented as such. Like, have they done a good job in cracking down on these things, or do you think they still have a ways to go?
There has been progress, but I think there's so much more to be done, especially when it comes to places like Iran, when platforms don't really have an economic incentive to deal with their user base. They can't really sell ads or target Iranians directly. And as Masa mentioned, there's this huge issue of sanctions when it comes to dealing with Iran and Iranians. So that already makes things more complicated. There's also the language and cultural awareness issue that a lot of these platforms still lack. So when people start mass reporting an account that is basically an LGBTQ activist who may or may not live inside Iran, they just don't have that sort of awareness that it requires to deal with the type of comments or the type of reports that they receive to understand the circumstances and context before they make a decision. And let's not forget that a lot of these decisions are made by algorithms before they're passed on to human moderators. And that's an unfortunate but more increasingly present issue that we still need to figure out a way to deal with, especially when it comes to all these languages and cultures around the world, including Iran.
And I wanted to just take it back to Holly for just one last thing before we go to the Q&A. I could definitely talk to you guys like all afternoon, but I think we should get some audience questions in as well. Holly, this question is a little bit left field, but I think you'll have an interesting take on it. So I was very interested when you brought up this idea of like tech solutionism that Evgeny Morozov has written about. And I was curious what your thoughts were about Elon Musk's Starlink endeavor. This has been touted as something that could help Iranians get past these internet shutdowns. Essentially, for anyone who doesn't know, basically Starlink would make the internet available to people through relatively cheap satellite dishes that they could buy. Do you have thoughts on this and kind of other technological methods of circumvention? Do you think this kind of presents an actual solution to this problem, or is this more like solutionism?
Well, I have to say, I was one of those silly people that once tweeted at Elon Musk asking if he can help Iranians. So, but we've come to know that when Starlink was launched, the website actually didn't have Iran initially as a list of countries. And over time, so many people, I guess, tweeted at Elon Musk, which he never responded to anybody, and they kind of changed the way their website is laid out. So you could type an address in Iran, and I think it'll say something like, quote, Starlink is not available in your area due to regulatory approval. And so there was this, and there's some truth to that. And essentially, a lot of people, myself included, initially thought, well, this is great. These internet shutdowns are becoming such a regular thing in countries like Iran. This is going to actually help Iranians. And what we came to understand is actually, no, this is not going to give free and unfettered access to Iranians. You actually need to work with the Iranian government in some ways. I think, I don't want to get into the technicalities here, but essentially you do need that regulatory approval from the Islamic Republic, and you do need infrastructure on the ground. And not surprisingly, believe it or not only does the Islamic Republic see social media as a national security threat, they now see satellite internet as a national security threat. So much so that I think in February of 2021, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme Council of Cyberspace actually said that. And he said it was an existential threat to the NIN. And they went as far to actually install a task force to counter the issue. But ironically, Iran is also expressing interest in China's version of Starlink. So you can imagine where they're going with that. They want to be able to control it.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Okay, we have quite a few good questions, I think, from the audience. So let's start with one from Barbara Slavin. She's asking, isn't the government worried that restricting apps such as Instagram will place too much pressure on an already weak economy? If the new law goes through, will Iranians still be able to access foreign apps? Perhaps that's one for Masa, or if anyone else wants to take it.
Yeah, sure. So we were discussing that there's been a lot of blowback from a wide spectrum of society in Iran against this bill. And the tech sector, startups, even startups that have had a reputation of cooperating with the government and the National Information Network, they have been protesting this bill for the very reason that Barbara is outlining in her question, which is it's going to have massive implications for the economy. I mean, there were estimates of when the internet shutdown occurred, which was just international traffic in November 2019, that billions of dollars was lost during that shutdown of just while maintaining the national internet. So it's going to have far-reaching consequences. The thing is, the way that they have framed the bill, it says that they will be throttling the foreign services for a period of time until some decision is made for either permanent censorship or cooperation. And so we're kind of waiting to see how the implementation of this bill is going to be, what kind of technical capabilities they are going to be having to block VPNs. We've been seeing some evidence of them blocking proxies, already starting the throttling of these applications. I think the question is, do the people who are actually, writing this bill care about the economy in those, in that framework? So it's kind of an open-ended, I guess, question of seeing the practicalities of the bill and really who are the folks who are part of the committee that are drafting this bill, which are very conservatives.
Gotcha. And we have another one. This is from an anonymous person. Would you be able to speak on foreign partnerships regarding social media and internet control? Any overt partnerships with China or Russia? That's a really interesting one to me because there's so many similarities and differences, I think, between Iran's internet controls and those of China and Russia. Has anyone looked at this in particular? Anyone want to speak to this?
I mean, I'm not an expert on this topic. There are far better people to speak to this than me, but just one thing that I was following was the Huawei case. And if anyone knows about the arrest of the Huawei executive who was detained in Canada, and I believe she was returned now to China, but that whole case was over the sales of equipment by Huawei to Iran and breaking sanctions. So there is lots of evidence that shows the cooperation and purchases of equipment, potentially equipment that are on export control lists for censorship and surveillance between China and Iran. And now we have the Iran-China deal as well. And there's lots of cooperation between Iran and Russia. Before Iran censored Telegram, Russia had censored Telegram, and there were even meetings between officials between the countries before Iran implemented their censorship to, I guess, get kind of tips on how to do it.
Yeah. I think that explains it really well, actually. I'd forgotten about that Huawei deal. This one is for Samin, I think, from Ashlan Gruwell. I've heard quite a bit about the issue of miscommunication and unnecessary censorship due to language barriers. How can we prevent that, in your opinion? And do you have an example that you can share?
Sure. I think the issue is mostly lack of context or understanding of context when it comes to the human side of content moderation. So going beyond algorithms or relying solely or mostly on algorithms in order to make things better is not a solution. When it comes to contexts like Iran or any other challenging environment, really, we need a more all hands on deck kind of approach that takes into consideration who the political actors are, who may be motivated to pursue different types of disinformation or information operations, and what is the approach in that moment in order to mitigate the situation. I mean, I have immense respect for people who are doing this work at different companies. But I think the number of people with language capabilities in these companies, especially Instagram, is very limited. And when we talk about understanding of language, let me be blunt, we're not talking just about having a language certificate in Persian or Arabic to deal with these contexts. We need someone who actually understands what's going on the ground. And so maybe a different hiring approach might be a solution. And regarding an example, I think when the unfortunate genocide situation started in Myanmar, a lot of activists and human rights defenders from the country started making partnerships and trying their voices to be heard. And that was the moment that Facebook started paying more attention to the situation in the country, because what was going on Facebook was actually instigating killings of a lot of people on the ground. And so it took a lot of time for the company to start paying attention. But when these advocates managed to mobilize and kind of like be heard more effectively was when people were assigned to that specific context, and companies started to have a more meaningful presence either on the ground or remotely from like the region, but in a way that somewhat tried to address the situation more directly.
We have another one from Tuwilika Kakuika. I would like to know how media companies, specifically print or online newspapers, cope with so much limitation and access to social media, because newspapers and journalists use social media to a large extent, be it for contacting sources, distribution, circulation, and even advertising and readership. Holly, have you looked at that at all, or has anyone looked at that in particular?
Well, I think I could start with the statistic from the Iranian Students Polling Agency that came out, I think, in fall of last year. And it said that 41% of Iranians use social media and online outlets as a form of news. A lot of Iranian media outlets actually have Telegram channels. Some have Instagram accounts, and of course, there are the state media ones, and even not state media, but other ones as well also have Twitter accounts. So, I mean, they're very much on social media and messaging apps, and when you walk in the streets of Tehran, you go to a kiosk, you'll find at least a dozen newspapers in print as well that people still purchase. So I can only explain it in that context, that I think both mediums are very much used, but Iranians, of course, are spending a lot more time on their phone, just like in the West during the pandemic. People are looking at their phone a lot more, and that's how they're able to get their content. And I think we should throw in the diaspora satellite factor. There's numerous Persian language news channels that Iranians tune into, and some do it listening to podcasts. For example, BBC Persian has a daily podcast. They're driving around the city. So they're able to get it, but it really, I guess, is a preference factor here.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. Masa, actually, I wanted to circle back to you on this issue of mass reporting. I think you mentioned that you have something to add that's sort of fairly recent. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, the thing that I was listening to Simin, and what was really interesting with some of the recent things I was noticing and the stuff she's been following is that Iranians are convinced that a lot of the takedowns that are happening on Instagram, which seems to be on a very massive scale, they're convinced that it's because of mass reporting. And I can't necessarily speak to that because I don't have any of the evidence. The only people who can really tell us that these takedowns are occurring because of mass reporting are Meta themselves. But time and time again, every time these events happen and they become headline news in Persian media. So a few weeks ago, we had the Ukraine Airlines victims hold a campaign, I will light a candle too. And folks started noticing that hashtag was being limited, and everyone just concluded that the Islamic Republic's, online armies had reported the hashtag to the point that Instagram was limiting it. And so Instagram came out with a statement kind of denying that it was mass reporting. It was kind of a technical error. We saw the same thing over the weekend again with this comedian, Zainab Musabi. Her account was taken down, and BBC Persian even ran a headline when the account was taken down that the Islamic Republic armies were responsible for this account being taken down because she had posted a video making fun of the president, and she got a lot of blowback for that, and that was the general conclusion. But again, Meta came and said, no, this was not the reason. This was an error in the way we interpreted the Persian content. We didn't pick up on the satire, which harkens back to what Simin was saying, that you need more than a certificate of knowing how to read Persian to be able to do content moderation. And so, yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, and kind of spoke to these two simultaneous things of, we know that, the Islamic Republic has these resources and armies online. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, we don't necessarily have a lot of transparency from the companies to address these situations. So there's a lot of distrust right now by Iranians on, their presence on Instagram.
Yeah. Just on the subject of the companies, there's another question in here about them that I think is actually really interesting. This might be a good one for Holly. The question's from Jacob Jones. He said, we see Iran can be relatively quick in blocking some apps like TikTok, while they don't block others at all, like Clubhouse, which I remember something that was in your paper as well. How does Iran gauge which apps are a threat, and how does the Iranian government make these decisions? Oh, Holly, you're muted.
You would think after 2 years. Anyways, actually, Clubhouse is blocked. It's been blocked since April. I think it was literally like a month after the fact that it had become popular in Iran. It got blocked. There's just no government acknowledgement of it. And people are so used to using VPNs, unfortunately, and whatnot, that it's just become normalized. I can't really tell you why TikTok is blocked. It's for starters, even with the VPNs, it probably, from what I've spoken to a journalist in Iran, it has probably thousands of users in Iran, which means it's not as popular. It's also interesting to note that this is despite the fact that Iran and China have this 25-year strategic accord, that they've decided to block this Chinese-owned company, or once Chinese-owned company. So I really can't explain why, but I'm gonna guess that it's because it's more of a interactive social media platform. You can do like lip syncing and dancing and whatnot. Maybe they saw it in that regard and they looked at it and were like, okay, this is going to be a headache for us. Dub Smash has certainly been a headache for the Islamic Republic. Last year, there was this Iranian diaspora pop singer, Sasi Mankan, who had the song called Tehran Tokyo, and he had invited Iranians to participate in what he called the Somaya Challenge. And Iranians were using Dub Smash, and for those of you not familiar, it's a video lip syncing app. And it had gone viral in Iran, that this Somaya challenge, that Iranians were using it. And the reason that really upset authorities was that he had actually included this popular adult film actress named Alexis Texas, who made a cameo in this video. And it was such a controversy in the country that why was this porn star in this video? And just to add this other caveat, she's reportedly the most popular porn star in Iran. I'll leave you with the imagination there, what that means, but it was a big topic in the country. And so the authorities came out and said, well, if you use Dub Smash and you participate, we're going to arrest you. And so that should just give you an idea of maybe why TikTok was seen as problematic.
And then we have just one, I guess we can make this maybe the final question, unless anyone has anything else burning. This is also from Barbara Slavin. It's on a slightly different topic, but I wonder if anyone can speak to this. Can anyone say a word about how the MEK hacked Arab, the state broadcaster, today? Do they have help from an intel agency? It requires some educated speculation, but does anyone want to take this up?
I will entertain it. Well, I think we have to remember that intelligence agencies have also infiltrated Iran's nuclear facilities. So my guess is maybe because people are able to bribe with a bag of cash, given that the country is in a dire situation economically, maybe they were able to pay somebody and they got somebody that works at Arab to do this. I mean, this is just a real basic thinking. Or, I mean, we had these Adolat Ali or Ali's Justice last year hack into Avian prison cameras. So maybe somebody was able to hack into the state media broadcaster. And these are just speculations and some theories about why that might have happened. But yes, that did happen. And it was something very brief. And I think a lot of Iranians are amused, but also confused by it that it happened. So,
yeah. Okay, so I would love to end with some final thoughts from the three of you. This has been a really interesting, wide-ranging conversation. I'm going to ask a question that hopefully you won't hate, but I'm very curious to know what your thoughts are on kind of what we're going to see in the next few years in terms of the internet use in Iran, interpreted sort of however you feel, whether it's, what is it going to look like to use the internet after the bill is passed? What is it going to look like when the NIN is used much more widely than it is today? And then also, what is it going to look like from the perspective of international internet companies that want to serve Iranian users? So let's start with Samin, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I think the cat and mouse sort of game that we've been seeing with regard to censorship in Iran is going to continue no matter what, and despite the bill being passed or not. It's going to get harder for people to bypass the censorship apparatus of Iran. The push to kind of migrate everyone or convince everyone to migrate to the National Information Network will become harder and more pervasive. But I think that one important and interesting aspect will be to monitor how this push is going to play out in terms of the power grab inside the country. Because when certain platforms are promoted, it means that there's money behind it. And whoever gets behind those platforms is obviously after a share of that sort of revenue, as we've seen with regard to domestic messaging applications, IPTVs, and so on. And this issue on its own is going to affect power dynamics in Iran in interesting and unprecedented ways, I guess.
Masa?
I agree with Samin's closing remarks, and I just want to thank Holly again for bringing this issue very center, especially in DC in the lead up to the possible implementation of this bill. I don't exactly know what it's going to look like in practice when this bill comes into force, so it's really hard to predict. But like it was said before me, this cat and mouse game between Iranians and their censors has been going on even before the internet was introduced. And so, the thing that's holding back the enforcement of the bill right now are, the power plays and the power dynamics of who is going to have say in what and have like Simin said, who's going to be making money out of this new reality. And so that's really what's holding back the finalization of the bill at the moment. So I imagine that will color a lot of what we will be seeing. And I mean, when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran, corruption never fails to show up. And we've already seen it. I mean, we had a case with Rubica, which was the Instagram kind of alternative in Iran. And we saw kind of the practice of corruption and making a national platform available in the wake of the implementation of this bill, misusing government funds to make it seem like they were a relevant application. So we're probably going to see a lot more of that.
And Holly, I'll let you have the last word. Mute.
Nah. Okay, did I thought I unmuted myself, apparently not. So so what I was saying, I don't know how I'm going to top Masa or Simin's comments because they really hit the nail on the head there. I'm worried about the future of Iranians and their ability to connect to the outside world. And it's something that I really heard repeatedly in my discussions with Iranians inside the country. And the one takeaway is that I hope that not only does the Biden administration listen to some of our recommendations here and in the report, but also that technology companies, especially Meta and Facebook, pay attention to more of what we're saying here and take action. I know that they're not going to be making money in Iran, but sometimes you should be thinking about the greater well-being of societies, whether they're in the West or in authoritarian countries.
I think that's a great point at which to close up. I just want to thank all three of our panelists. I learned so much today, and we're really, really grateful that you've shared your expertise with us. Thank you so much to the audience for turning up, and please do stay in touch, and please do check out Holly's paper for even more depth. Thank you all, and take care.
Thank you, Mega. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you.